What is there that I could say about Borderlands that hasn't already been said? Probably not too much, if we're being honest. It's likely to be one of my shorter videos, but I intend to say it anyway. So Borderlands was originally published by Take-Two, Proprietors of Rockstar, and the annual 2K sports titles, and developed by Gearbox, a Texas-based video game development company founded by student of artistic magic tricks, Randy Pitchford. There's so much more that could be said about that greasy sleazeball masquerading in a human suit, but I just don't have the time. Gearbox had some fine enough titles under the belt even before Borderlands. Opposing Force and Blue Shift being stapled onto Half-Life at their start definitely got them on the right foot, eventually even helping out with the PC ports of Halo and Pro Skater 3. Eventually though, 2009 comes around and changes everything with the release of Borderlands. And when I say changes everything, I mean that between 2009 and at time of writing, Gearbox has been involved in some way with the development of 15 different releases, one of which is a game currently in development. If we remove remasters and collection-type titles, we're left with 11, and of those 11, 6 of them are Borderlands or Borderlands-related. No matter what you say about it, there's no denying the popularity. But is that popularity earned? Is Pandora a fun enough place to warrant a visit and forking over $30 entire for its Game of the Year Enhanced Edition on Steam, since the original Game of the Year version is unable to be bought separately from its enhanced variant? Is Borderlands worth it? To start with, you might notice every so often there's a bit of a performance dip. I prefer to run my games at 1080p 60, at least for these reviews, that's my standard. The game, however, doesn't care. It reset the refresh rate to 24Hz seemingly at random. Finding any kind of solution online was a 50-50 shot of people claiming it's either a UI bug or an issue with my screen itself, which I know it isn't. I saw a solution that suggested disabling the frame rate limits in the game's options while enabling VSync, but that didn't really help. In the end, I just set the FPS cap to 60 in-game and then turned on the VSync regardless. For the most part, this made the game run okay, but it wouldn't solve all my problems. There were 3 areas where even when I lowered the settings, the game just shit the bed. I don't know how or why, but these were 3 story-important locations in the game, with some of the more visually interesting level designs, peppered by some of the tougher enemies that the game has on offer. In short, the worst time for this to happen. Some guns also had an issue with ADS in that the spot you're actually aiming at isn't where the gun's sight suggests you are. The damage feedback is at times aggravating, with excessive blood splatter and on-screen graphics sometimes making everything a visual mess and hard to read, but it's so much of an irritant that I can only assume, at least in the case of the blood splatter, that it's a bug or a glitch of some kind. There's a slew of other issues I've seen online but haven't experienced myself, so I can't speak for those problems specifically, but I can say that this iteration of Borderlands, the Game of the Year Enhanced Edition, has some problems. Past that, as introductions go, Borderlands is good. The presentation of this game overall is great, in fact. The sandblasted landscape goes well with the almost comic book style art design, and great song on show here, that I obviously can't share with you. Cage the Elephants ain't no rest for the wicked. This introduction is good. It isn't as good when compared to the sequels, but it is a good first attempt. Also showcases one of the characters you'll be interacting with in the game, Marcus, equal parts arms dealer, video game expository narrator, and bus driver, apparently. You'd think with Pandora being Pandora, his gun running would be lucrative enough that he wouldn't have to be misogynistic Miss Frizzle from time to time, minus the science lessons, of course. In the back of the bus are the 4 classes you can pick from. They go by the names of Mordecai, Lilith, Roland, and Brick. Now, normally I'm the snipe from a distance sneaky kind of guy, but in terms of individual class capabilities, there's not as much difference as you might hope, and more importantly, Lilith is ultimately the main character of the series, at least up to Borderlands 3. So she's who I played as for this run. More on that as I delve further into the series in the future of the channel. Surprise, surprise, these classes all have a class-specific action skill, like Mordecai sicking his bird Bloodwing on people and Lilith's phase walk. It's the most differentiating thing between the different classes. The skill trees themselves are a bit lackluster, though. Most of these boil down to increasing X number or percentage. There are exceedingly few that actually change the action skill itself that class has available in a tangible way, which makes any kind of playstyle variety within players of that class just as lacking. The guns that you can get are likewise tame as compared to later titles. I found myself focusing more on damage numbers than anything else, and weirdly, even guns with one of the game's elemental affinities didn't stack up quite as well to just a standard bullet from a standard gun. In a game with multiple tiers of potential loot, this was disappointing. The really interesting stuff is mostly found towards the late game, which makes sense from a progression standpoint, but from a mechanical one, I don't know. Sure, it might be impractical to have a high-pitched gun screaming with every shot you fire, but it's fun. The semi-staleness here also repeats itself with the enemy variety in-game. There just isn't much. Lots of guys in varying attires with guns, in fact almost entirely bandits up until a later point in the game. Having said that, the gameplay is still solid. It's satisfying to shoot a bandit or a skag and watch the blood spray with each bullet. And then your weapon proficiency increases with use, so you're always getting better statistically with whatever weapon you're using. The head pop of a critical mixes with the actual damage number pop up so well that Borderlands is one of the main reasons why I've preferred sniping in games like this. The second wind, a brief period of time after you're down that allows you to effectively respawn on the spot if you can kill an enemy within its time frame, is just a good mechanic. Nothing kills the flow of combat quite like having to hike it back from a checkpoint, and this helps alleviate that, and keeps you in the fray. An entirely unrelated issue I have is that while the game does have hashtag quirky and occasionally genuinely interesting characters, they don't have too much dialogue. More specifically, a lot of their character exists primarily within mission briefings and debriefings. I'm convinced Tannis has the most spoken lines of any character in the entire game, since there are multiple quests that require you to gather her diary entries from before the events of the game. This issue extends even further into the main villain, though it should be known that I use the term villain loosely. In fact, this is your spoiler warning. Here's where you get off the ride, and here's where you get back on. Okay, so, story time. Gonna be honest. Doesn't matter. You're meant to gather a bunch of pieces to a key to a vault, and each of these pieces is guarded by a boss of some kind, normally a guy with a gun, except in one instance where it's guarded by a rak hive. This is done for Tannis, a crazed scientist woman who's been studying the vault for a hot minute. All throughout, you're also threatened by one Commandant Steele, a woman who claims that pretty much everything on Pandora belongs to the Atlas Corporation. This back and forth between you and the villain isn't actually back and forth at all, it's very one-sided. Furthermore, Commandant Steele is the worst kind of one-note villain, the useless kind. Her subordinates in the Crimson Lance are infinitely more dangerous than she is just by virtue of the fact she doesn't even do anything herself to hurt you. At least the Crimson Lance actually shoot at you. All Steele does is threaten you, make a quote-unquote deal with Tannis that results in Tannis' capture, and dies when she finally gets her goal and opens the vault. She is the single most disappointing aspect of the game, yes, even more so than the performance problems, and is one of the most nothing characters I've dealt with in a video game period. Even when she comes back as Steel Trap in the DLC, she was more of a threat than she was in the base game. Then there's the final boss itself, the Destroyer. A stationary enemy with obvious weak spots to shoot, plus adds to Merc if you get into second wind, just another disappointment. The ending also has very we've got more on the way vibes. Between a DLC teaser and that Hyperion satellite your guardian angel seems to be reaching you through, the latter of which is in hindsight a bit of a spoiler moment in itself for the sequel, Borderlands unfortunately ends on a low note, and the actual main story missions are so repetitive with mostly forgettable faces that it genuinely isn't worth getting into, and is the primary reason why this review is as short as it is. Welcome back, you didn't miss much. So, how do I feel about Borderlands? Well, I feel about it the same way I do about Dead Space and Diablo and Mass Effect. Really all first entries in a series that I'm familiar with. Yes, Borderlands itself is a good time. It's a solid foundation for what came after, but I'd much rather play what came after, you know? The loot could use some more characters, more spoken dialogue, and more character outside of accepting and turning in missions. The performance could really use polish, and both the main antagonist and final boss were closer to annoyances than anything credible, leaving me with a what a waste mindset as the credits rolled. But the music is good, the gameplay is fun, the presentation is also good, and the characters that were actually developed were interesting enough to warrant the focus. It's not necessary to really understand the plot and characters going forward, so you don't have to get it if you're super worried about plot relevance. But it isn't a waste of money either if you are super invested. Whatever you do though, the Game of the Year Enhanced Edition isn't the one you want to play. Next up is Dead Space 2. I'll see you later. Story up.